Welcome to the debate. So, imagine you're trapped in a flipped truck, right? The water is rising past your chin.
Nightmare scenario.
Absolute nightmare. And a 2,000-pound shark is circling the glass, just, bumping against the driver's side door. What does your brain actually do?
Well, traditional survival manuals tell you to calculate, right? Equalize the pressure, execute a flawless escape plan.
Right, exactly. But psychology tells us something terrifying. In that moment, the rational version of you it's already completely offline.
Yeah, that perfectly algorithmic survival manual we all think we have in our heads. It's the first thing to wash away when the water actually hits your chest.
Exactly. And today we're looking at a piece of media that captures that exact psychological collapse. We're talking about the 2026 survival thriller, Thrash.
Such an intense film.
It really is. And on its surface, it's a standard creature feature. But we're going to examine it through the highly nuanced psychological framework of internal family systems, or IFS.
Right.
Specifically, we're zooming in on the film's most intense and probably most controversial sequence. Our protagonist, Dakota, trapped in that flipped, flooding truck.
It's arguably the defining moment of the whole film.
Oh, for sure. The central question we're exploring today centers on her climactic decision to finally abandon the perceived safety of that truck.
Yeah.
When she forces her way out into the open water, is this a courageous, calculated act led by her true, integrated self? Or is it a purely impulsive, panic-driven reaction by her internal firefighter part, simply trying to escape the immediate terror of claustrophobia?
And honestly, how we answer that question, it changes everything about what this movie is actually trying to say about human trauma.
Definitely. So I'll be arguing that Dakota's actions represent a tragic, systemic psychological collapse. That leap into the water is driven entirely by the impulsive firefighter part of her psyche.
And I'll be arguing the exact opposite, actually. Her decision to leave the truck is a profound breakthrough. It's a moment of self-leadership where she boldly confronts her primal fears rather than just, waiting to die in a state of mental and physical paralysis.
Okay, so to understand my perspective on this, we really have to look at the mechanics of an IFS system error. When trauma hits, the internal system attempts to manage it.
Right, the manager part steps in.
Exactly. Initially, we see Dakota's manager part highly active. The manager's entire goal is to prevent disaster by maintaining rigid control and suppressing emotion. To the manager, panicking means instant death.
Yeah.
And we see the physiological reality of this in the first half of the scene. Dakota's checking the window seals, she's mentally calculating the rising water levels, she's consciously holding her breath to practice, rationing her oxygen.
She's essentially trying to mathematically solve her way out of an unsolvable nightmare.
Precisely. The manager thinks it can outthink a shark. But human working memory has a strict biological limit. When the water level breaches her chest, the cognitive load simply maxes out.
The math stops working.
Right. Her prefrontal cortex physically cannot process the math anymore. At this moment, the manager is violently hijacked by the firefighter. In IFS theory, firefighters are parts that operate purely on impulse. Their only job is to extinguish immediate emotional or physical pain, totally regardless of the collateral damage. And the mechanism of that hijack is right there on the screen. Her eyes stop darting around looking for solutions. They go completely wide and blank.
The dissociation kicks in.
Exactly. That is the moment of dissociation. The firefighter unplugs her from reality. The frantic door kicking, the massive oxygen-wasting screams, that's not a brave choice to face a predator. It's the firefighter prioritizing the immediate cessation of claustrophobia over any long-term survival logic.
Right.
She isn't bravely facing the shark, she is fleeing the agonizing pain of the enclosed space.
Well, I come at it from a different way. I don't disagree that the firefighter exhibits this chaotic, frantic energy throughout that scene. But I think you're misreading the final action.
How so?
Dakota's ultimate decision to leave the truck represents the emergence of the self. In IFS, the self is the core of the psyche, right? It's characterized by clarity, courage, and connection.
Okay, but where is the clarity in kicking a door open into shark-infested water?
Well, to understand why her exit is a self-led action, we have to look at why the manager's strategy had to fail. Hypercalculation in a situation with zero good variables, it inevitably leads to a complete system crash.
Oh, you're talking about the moment she drops the tools.
Yes, exactly. The wrench. When the manager tries to carefully, methodically unlock the jammed door while the water is rising, it violently clashes with the firefighter's sheer primal terror.
The logic versus the panic.
Right.
The manager is saying, be still and work the lock. And the amygdala is screaming, move now or die. What happens? We get a physiological freeze state.
Mm-hmm.
The sympathetic nervous system hits a contradictory wall. Dakota's fine motor skills completely evaporate. Her hands tremble uncontrollably, and the wrench slips into the murky water below.
A total system deadlock.
Exactly. The system is deadlocked. The manager cannot execute its plan, and the firefighter is just screaming in the background. Stepping out into the water is the self finally breaking this internal deadlock.
Interesting.
It's a decisive, grounding move to confront her exiles, those deeply repressed primal fears of helplessness, rather than just drowning while her internal parts fight over the steering wheel.
Wait, I'm getting stuck on something here. If the self is supposed to be this calm, grounding presence, how can you argue that bursting out of a car into shark-infested waters is calm?
Well,
To a layman, that looks exactly like blind, unhinged panic. Help me bridge that gap, because looking at the physical acting on screen, I don't see clarity. I see someone completely losing their mind.
that's a great distinction to make, actually. We tend to think of calm as sitting still on a meditation cushion, breathing deeply.
Right, Zen.
Yeah, but in a trauma state, clarity doesn't look peaceful. Clarity looks like radical acceptance of a horrific reality. The manager was operating under a delusion, the idea that if she just solved the mechanical problem of the door, the shark would somehow cease to be a threat.
A false peace.
Exactly. A false peace. The self isn't calm because it's relaxed. It's calm because it sees the truth. The truck is not a safe zone. It's a coffin filling with water. Breaking out isn't panic. It's the self taking the only viable action left once the illusion of control is gone.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I don't buy that the truck wasn't at least a temporary safe zone. It's a physical barrier.
Is it, though?
Let me give you an analogy to explain how I see this internal mechanism working. Think of the manager like a computer's operating system running a complex, resource-heavy virus scan.
Okay.
It's taking up all the CPU, trying to fix the problem logically. The firefighter is someone walking by and just yanking the power cord out of the wall because they think the computer's running too hot.
Huh. All right.
Coda does it. Isn't the system rebooting into clarity? It's the power cord being ripped out. The system has failed.
But what if the computer is literally on fire? Yanking the cord isn't a glitch in that scenario. It's the only way to stop the entire motherboard from melting into slag. You're holding on to this idea that the manager's virus scan was actually going to work.
It might have bought her time.
It wasn't going to work. If you're listening to this and screaming at your dashboard, just stay in the car, you are heavily siding with the manager. You want to believe that logic can conquer nature, but the film is showing us that it can't.
You brought up the audience screaming at their dashboards, which leads perfectly into how people actually received this scene.
Oh, here we go.
If we look at the discourse surrounding Thrash, particularly the heavy critiques on platforms like Reddit, the prevailing sentiment is that the film suffers from wasted potential.
Yeah, I've seen those threads.
Viewers repeatedly called out inconsistent, frustrating, and frankly, stupid character writing. People hated that she dropped the wrench. They hated that she kicked the door and wasted oxygen.
They wanted her to be perfect.
Exactly. And I argue that the IFS framework actually validates this audience frustration. Because Dakota lacks consistent self-leadership, we as the audience are subjected to this exhausting tug-of-war between the manager and the firefighter.
Mm-hmm.
It makes her appear fragile, deeply inconsistent, and hyper-vulnerable. Audiences expect characters to have a fully integrated prefrontal cortex in situations where actual humans lose theirs. They wanted a hero led by the self, and instead they got a raw system error.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that those critics entirely misunderstand psychological realism?
How do you mean?
The audience's frustration stems from their desire for a traditional, invulnerable cinematic protagonist. They want that algorithmic survival manual we talked about. But the inconsistency they're complaining about is actually a profoundly accurate portrayal of complex trauma.
So you're saying the frustrating narrative choices weren't bad writing, but a deliberate reflection of a traumatized psyche fragmenting under pressure?
Absolutely. Think about how trauma actually works on the brain. Under extreme duress, the psyche doesn't act as a unified front. It splinters.
Right.
The film forces Dakota into a situation where she cannot simply action hero her way out. She is forced to face the ghosts of her exiles. In IFS, exiles are the most vulnerable parts of us. They carry our deepest traumas, our pure terror, our profound isolation.
The root of the fear.
Yes. And in Thrash, those internal exiles aren't just memories, they are externalized and materialized as the monster hunting her. That shark is the physical embodiment of being consumed, of being helpless.
Yeah, I see that.
Her fragmented behavior, bouncing wildly between the manager's cold math and the firefighter's screaming panic, isn't a script flaw. It is a painstakingly realistic depiction of a mind striving to find itself under unprecedented duress. We are watching the messy, ugly process of psychological survival.
You know, you bring up the exiles, and I think that's actually the key to this whole thing. Because what is she really running from when she kicks that door open?
The isolation.
Right. It isn't just the shark. The shark is a biological threat, yes, but the real terror is what the shark represents to her internal system. The exiles in Dakota's psyche hold her foundational fears, the fear of being entirely powerless, of being trapped, and of dying completely alone in the dark.
Which is the exact physical reality she finds herself in. It's the ultimate nightmare realized.
Exactly. It's a perfect psychological storm. But here is where we fundamentally disagree on the mechanism of her escape.
Okay.
My position is that the firefighter's ultimate victory, which is forcing her physical body out of that truck, is simply an avoidance mechanism. When she leaves the truck, she isn't nobly facing her fears.
You think she's running away?
She is engaging in the ultimate biological flight response. The firefighter cannot tolerate the exile surfacing as the water rises and the dark isolation sets in, so it ejects her from the environment entirely. It is a desperate escape from internal psychological pain, not a brave confrontation with external physical reality.
But how can it be an avoidance mechanism when she is literally swimming directly into the mouth of the apex predator?
Because
that doesn't make logical sense. If the firefighter just wants safety, why would it push her toward the shark?
Because to the firefighter, the immediate sensory horror of suffocating in a small metal box is an intolerable activation of the exile's trauma. The firefighter doesn't do long-term math.
Right, it's impulsive.
It doesn't weigh the probability of a shark bite against the probability of drowning. It just knows the box is currently causing agony, and the agony must stop right this second. It's pure reactivity. The firefighter unplugs the computer because the fan is loud, completely ignoring that the house is on fire.
I have to push back strongly on this idea that she was just blindly ejected. Insisting that the firefighter is the one driving here ignores the consequence of the alternative.
Which is staying in the truck?
Yes. We talked about the freeze state earlier. That moment she drops the wrench and her hands go numb, remaining in that freeze state is exactly how the exiles win.
How so?
A freeze state is the ultimate biological manifestation of helplessness. It's the dorsal vagal response, shutting the body down for death.
The playing dead response?
Yes. And by physically leaving the truck, Dakota actively shatters that paralysis. She strips away the manager's false, comforting sense of control. She cuts through the firefighter's chaotic, blinding noise. And she meets the physical embodiment of our exile face-to-face in the open water. That requires the grounding presence of the self. The firefighter cannot look a predator in the eye. It only knows how to hide or thrash.
So you view the physical act of entering the water, despite the overwhelming presence of the shark, as a radical acceptance of reality. It's not running away, it's stepping into the arena.
Exactly. It is the self stepping in and saying, the manager's math cannot save us, and the firefighter's panic is blinding us. The only way out is through.
Wow.
The self recognizes that the truck is no longer a sanctuary, it is a tomb. The courage isn't in fighting the shark because she can't fight a 2,000-pound animal.
Obviously not.
The profound courage is in overriding the manager's demand for a perfect plan and the firefighter's demand for dissociation. And when we say dissociation, we aren't just using a buzzword. Look at Dakota's eyes right as she breaches the surface of that water. The blankness is gone. She is sharply, agonizingly present.
She is present for a deeply horrific reality, and I think, honestly, that's why this scene is so deeply uncomfortable for audiences to watch.
Definitely.
We want to believe that if we try hard enough, the manager will always save us, that our logic will prevail. And if logic fails, we want to believe that our raw, primal fighter energy will give us the superhuman strength to survive.
Yeah.
But you're arguing that both of those parts fail her, and the only thing left is to just look the monster in the eye.
Yes. And that's a terrifying pill for a general audience to swallow. It's much easier to call it bad writing than to accept that our own internal managers are fundamentally powerless against certain forces of nature.
It highlights the brilliance of applying this specific psychological framework to a genre film. Let's look at what this means for the movie as a whole.
Okay.
From my perspective, Thrash remains a tragic, incredibly intense case study of a complete system failure. I see the climax as the moment the impulsive firefighter violently overthrows the exhausted manager, leading to a desperate, dissociative escape.
Right, the system abort.
Yeah. Dakota doesn't choose to face the monster. Her system simply crashes because it cannot endure the claustrophobic terror of her own mind anymore. The tragedy is that her psychology breaks before her body does.
And from my perspective, the film captures the agonizing, messy birth of self-leadership.
The breakthrough.
Yes. Dakota is a character who must physically and mentally shatter her own internal paralysis. She has to abandon the illusion of the manager's control to bravely and consciously confront the primal terror of her exiles. Her leap into the water isn't a system crash. It's the ultimate synthesis of a fractured psyche finally waking up to an impossible reality.
Well, what we certainly find convergence on is that viewing Thrash through the lens of internal family systems elevates the film dramatically.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thriller, and reveals it to be a profound exploration of human trauma. It forces us to look closely at the competing parts of our own psychology under extreme pressure.
It really does. It reframes all those supposed inconsistencies that audiences complained about into a mirror of our own fragmented minds.
Exactly.
We all have managers trying to desperately control the uncontrollable. We all have firefighters ready to rip the power cord out of the wall to stop the pain. And we all have exiles waiting in the dark.
Whether Dakota's final desperate leap into the floodwaters was a triumph of the integrated self or a tragedy of the panicked firefighter remains a beautifully complex question embedded deeply within the text of the film.
And it's one we might never fully answer.
True. It suggests that the next time listeners find themselves re-examining a piece of intense cinema, or perhaps navigating their own moments of high stress, they might want to observe the subtle, often conflicting interplay of their own internal parts.
Because when the water actually starts rising in your own life, the math stops working very quickly.
It leaves you wondering, when the pressure becomes unbearable and your system starts to crash, which part of you is truly at the wheel?